Hi, this is Mr. Dunbar again. Last time in class we learned about the compound if. This is where you have an if statement that is paired up with an else if statement that is also paired up with possibly an else statement and finishes off with end if. And notice how they're all at approximately the same indentation. Well, not approximately, they all are at the same indentation. You may remember that you can have as many else if statements as you want, and only the first condition that is true gets executed. You may even remember that we looked at this example, which had multiple problems. First of all, the way that it's laid out right now, only students in high school or middle school will correctly get their grade level assessed. If you are in public school, you get missed because you get lumped in with middle school. To fix that, you need to reorder this compound if statement. So we need to take this final condition and move it up one. You may also remember that another thing that needed to be corrected was this equals sign. It needed to be removed because otherwise, if things got rearranged accidentally, a high school student would accidentally get labeled as a middle school student. The thing that we are actually looking at today are the nested if statements. You'll notice them right there. Like before, we have our if statement, and if this ends up being true, this first expression, you execute the code that you find in this block. So that is for true. Otherwise, you have to execute the code that's found in the other block. So this is for a false condition. Now, let's assume that this first expression is true. Then you have here another if statement. This is why we call it a nested if, because in this case, again, you have another if expression, which has to be evaluated. And if this one ends up being true, then you execute the first block of code right here. Otherwise, if that second Boolean expression ended up being false, you would have to run this second block of code. Now notice how, in this case, if our first expression is true, then none of the code down here will ever run. That is exactly how it works in any of the if statements that we've encountered so far. So let's look at this example. As always, the first thing we ought to do is make ourselves a T-chart. We put our variables in there, x and y, and we create our trace. So for x, we assign 5 to the variable. Whoops, my apologies. For y, we assign x plus 3, which happens to be 5 plus 3. So in this case, y is 8. Now we need to do our selections. So again, here we have our block. This is our first block. It executes if it's true. The second block executes if the Boolean expression is false. Here is the Boolean expression. Y is 8. X is 5. When we check, is 8 not equal to 5? Well, that's true. This means that we have to execute our first block of code, and we will have to execute this first line, which is print not equal. So we would then see not equal on the screen. At which point you have a nested if statement. So again, the same story. We have our Boolean expression. This first block of code gets run if it's true. The second block gets run if it's false. So let's evaluate this Boolean expression. X is 5. Looking at my trace, I can also see that y is 8. So, is 5 greater than 8? No, it is not. That means this is false. So this first block of code does not run. The second block of code runs, which means we see y is greater appear on the screen. Notice again how this last block of code does not run because the very first Boolean expression evaluated to true. Let's look at a second example. In this case, we have, again, our trace that we will create. We have the two variables, x and y. X is assigned 5, y is assigned 3. Now we can work with that. Again, we have a Boolean expression that we must evaluate. After we evaluate it, we have the true block and the false block. Inside the first true block, we have another Boolean expression. Inside the false block, we have a Boolean expression. So let's see what happens. If x is greater than 5, well, x is 5. So, is 5 greater than 5? No, it is not. So this is false, which means this first block does not run, and we go into the false block, where we have a third Boolean expression. Is y greater than or equal to 3? Well, 3 is greater than or equal to 3. It is equal to 3, so the first of the two blocks runs. So the true statement. So we are going to print machine head. Notice how we don't print 0 and we don't do anything in the first block. So this is our output for this program, 0. Here we have the program that you created last class. It asks the user for a month as a number, and it tells the user the month in words. You'll notice that the first few lines here all do the error checking. After that, I have the regular else-if statements which tell you which month it is. It turns the number into the actual month name. Now, we can very conveniently turn this blue block into a nested if statement. So what I'm going to do is just leave an extra space at the beginning and at the end, and I'll select this entire block of text and tab. Now, in this case, I will put up here an else, and I will convert this else if to an if, and I'll make sure that my if block is finished with an end if. So please notice this. So I added else, so this entire block of text is my else, and then I start with a new nested if statement. Notice how all the statements here begin on one line and that they end with an end if. And so now I've turned my previous program into a nested if, and it makes sense because the first few items check to see if there are errors, and the else statement accepts valid input and processes it. So, after you've finished looking at nested if, here is some practice for you. You are going to ask the user for two numbers and determine if both numbers are positive, if they're both negative, or if you have one positive and one negative. You can assume that 0 is positive. Here, the practice asks you to provide a nested and a non-nested solution. I want you to focus exclusively on the nested solution. We don't have the tools yet to properly do the non-nested solution. Thank you for watching, and make sure that you ask your teacher if you've got any questions.